Freedom Foundation President Wayne Hoffman, one of Idaho's most respected, influential public policy voices.
Hey, we're live. My name is Wayne, Idaho Freedom Foundation. I'm joined today by Senator Christy Zito and Representative Ron Nate, who also is a fellow at the Idaho Freedom Foundation. For being here. What's going on? What's in this podcast? Just hanging out?
Well, what a week to be on, Wayne. You picked a good one. Go, Christy.
We're hanging out. We're getting ready for the big event on Thursday.
Big event? Is it a birthday, maybe? A celebration of some kind? What could...
Let's call it a circus. The governor has it all planned out. He's got the ringleaders lined up and the events going on in both chambers. And his plan is to give the taxpayers some of their money back and then do the bidding for Reclaim Idaho. And so Reclaim Idaho will declare a victory if the governor's plan goes as scheduled.
They already are. They're already taking a victory lap.
They already are. Let's circle back a little. Outside of everything, in a vacuum, when the legislature, the bottom dollar amount left on the table was about somewhere in that vicinity. It was unspent. About $2 billion left on the table. So by a factor of 10, your surplus is right now. And in the vacuum, having a special do something about that $2 billion makes sense. Then answer the governor and members of the whole thing is off the rails. Kind of dissect this a little bit. Do you just conceptually special session to give the money who paid it?
I'm not 100% what you said there, because the audio feed I'm getting from you is really, really bad. But I think you were talking about the money that was on the table and what would be better things to do with it. So, I'm going to leave cutting the numbers and dicing and slicing that to Ron, because after all, he has a PhD in economics, and I've watched him like at Club for Growth events, parse numbers with the greatest economists in the United States, possibly even the world. But my issue with all of this is I've served 6 years now since you in the Senate, and I visited with thousands and thousands of people from across the state in all districts across the state. And I have never had somebody come up to me and say, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my house because I can't pay my income tax, or my income tax burden is too much. But I hear people talk about their property tax, and I hear people talk about the grocery tax continually. And now we're seeing that with inflation the way it is, and we're paying 18% more almost in reality, in real numbers. Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, more this year for our groceries than we did last year because of raw inflation. That increases our grocery tax burden. That's what I've heard people talk about. Nobody really cares about their income tax, maybe possibly unless you're on a corporate level or above that $70,000 a year level. So I'm kind of disappointed that we have all this money, but we're not doing the will of the people and what all of these cats have campaigned on years.
Can you hear me a little better now?
That's a little better now.
Okay, so you have that is 10 times as what you anticipated at the end of the, because you anticipated dollars left over at the end. Now you're looking at there being $2 billion at the end of the fiscal year equal. Do you agree that it's appropriate for the Levine to return the money, that this is something that should wait until January legislative session?
Well, I think that we are going into an extraordinary session because the governor is trying to preempt the Proposition 1, which proposes to raise taxes and also fund education. So I think the motivation for the governor, instead of being a strong leader and outright opposing a proposition and then leaving the legislative work to the legislature, he has chosen a different path, and he wants to do half of what Reclaim does, but also try and poke his finger in their eye by doing a tax cut instead of a tax increase. But I think I agree with you, Wayne, that $2 billion left on the table. The first instinct for any governor and any legislature should be to return the change to the taxpayers, especially in an era with high inflation that Biden is imposing on all of us with the Federal Reserve's help, that we have well over 8.5%, and it's probably more, probably in the teens, but it's being underreported. Inflation going on, gas prices through the roof, and families are feeling the pinch. They already have high property taxes. And so what's the governor going to do for that? An income tax cut, which is helpful. But why only a fourth of the surplus? Why not give the households back 3/4 of that surplus? Do real tax relief. He's doing an ongoing education increase of $410 million for the first year, increased by 3% a year through statutes, and doing an ongoing income tax cut of $160 million. Now, why would you put 2.5 times more towards education than you do to a tax cut? Because when taxpayers are the ones generating all of this surplus. Let's keep in mind too, that over the last 2 years, Idaho has increased spending for education by 42%. Did you get a 42% increase? I didn't get a 42% increase, but education has. And the governor wants to pile onto that instead of returning the money to the taxpayer. There's a lot more we could do. And we don't have to bend to the pressures of Reclaim Idaho. Just come out and say, you know what? That's bad policy. This is what we'll see, is if this is successful for the governor, it looks like he has the votes locked down for the most part. If it's successful, Reclaim Idaho will be empowered to do this every cycle. And you'll see this every cycle, and you'll see the governor be put in a pickle every cycle, and he'll bend.
Well, all we have to do is look at our neighboring states and see how this initiative process can really get out of hand. If you look at Washington State, and we'll go to the gun thing just for a second, the capacity on magazines, the 10-round capacity on magazines, that was an initiative. Every bad gun law that's gone through Washington State, except maybe 1 or 2 in the last 10 years, has happened by initiative. California is the same way. The really, really bad legislation in California has happened through the initiative process. And just like Medicaid expansion, that was supposed to save all these hardworking men and women in the state of Idaho so that, they didn't have to die outside the door of the emergency room or whatever, however that was played. The legislature has the power to not do these things, even though they pass the initiative on the ballot. We can still say no. And we had that opportunity to say no with Medicaid expansion, and now look what it's done. The legislature in the past has said no because, Wayne, you can tell me what year it is. I can't remember for sure. But term limits, I believe, passed on an initiative, and the legislature said no.
The term limit was another example that I like to use, though, because legislature to act in its own, to keep the career politicians. A better example comes from 1942. The vote passed what was called the Act, and the senior grandson said, if you're over 65, they'll give you a pension and take your costs. 1943 town and says, how do we this thing that the voters to pass? And so they light the money, and they immediately, and that's what we're supposed to do, because democracy. Are you you guys still having trouble? Ryan says that he's.
Yeah, it's still very
I'm
sketchy.
only getting about every third word. I don't know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Do
Do you have a
I guess.
whiteboard?
I don't know what to. I have nothing. Yeah, I don't know. So I'm not even sure if I ask a question you're going to hear what to do.
Yeah. Well, maybe Christy and I could talk to one another a bit. I don't know if that would work.
Maybe you guys can figure that out while we just kind of banter this back and forth here. Now, I don't know what the legislative remedy is for this session. Obviously, the governor wouldn't do what he's doing if he wasn't 100% totally confident that he has the votes to get this through without any interference at all. Ron, will there be like any kind of suspension of rule like that? Maybe people would like to hear what exactly the process will be. This will have to start in the House, will it not? Because it has to do with spending.
Yeah. There is always suspension of rules when you're trying to run a bill through the legislature in one day, because they have to suspend the 3-day rules that every bill should be read for 3 days, 3 consecutive days, and it's not going to happen. So there will be moves to suspend the rules to speed things up. But you're right, he has votes locked down. That's why he released the list of co-sponsors, which had 37 House members, which is barely a majority, and 25 senators, which is really a super majority there in the Senate. And so he thinks he has this done. But I've heard one or two, well, maybe several legislators are a little disappointed in the final product of the bill. It seems that House members were not given the bill before the governor made his proclamation. Many of those House members signed on to it without actually having read the bill, and which is a bad practice if you're a legislator. However, it might be good news for us that if they're looking at the bill now and seeing problems with it, like the automatic 3% increase in the education funding coming from the sales tax, then it might give them pause. And so there might be some room to do some procedural motions, maybe do some amendments and propose some changes to this that gives real tax relief to Idahoans when they're fighting inflation, and also restores the appropriation mechanism through the JFAC committee and the normal legislative process instead of doing only what the governor wants.
Right. I agree. And I'm hoping that maybe some of that will happen because, I want to see the citizens of Idaho have tax free, no question. What we're going through right now is unprecedented. We know as far as inflation and the numbers that we're seeing and what we're having to chase here. But I'd also like to point out that when we start talking about the surplus that we have, I think is that 45%, Ron, of our state budget now is federal money. So when we look at the surplus we have, how much of that is actually Idaho money? How much of that is actually really sales tax and income tax or whatever that we're generating, and not just a leftover from ARPA funds and Build Back Better funds and all of these other billions and billions of dollars, FEMA money that have trickled down into our state, and maybe not just trickled, but maybe poured in like you're going to pour water out of a 5-gallon bucket. So when I start looking at these tax issues and I start thinking about this and I start thinking about cuts and spending all this money and the ongoing increase, I'm a little bit concerned because what the federal government giveth, the federal government can take away. So what are your thoughts on that, Ron?
Yeah, when I first got into the legislature in 2015, the federal government, federal monies represented about 35% of the state budget. Now they're above 45%. So the federal government is taking over more and more of the controlling levers of the Idaho budget and therefore of Idaho policy. We saw just this last session approving $150 million for school lunches over 2 years. Sounded like a good thing to do for a lot of legislators. They voted for it. I voted against it because it's federal money and it usually comes with strings. And sure enough, the strings came. That the federal government then said, if you've accepted this money, now you have to make sure you bend to our woke agenda, including having special bathroom access for gender dysphoric students and whatnot. And so schools are left to make that difficult choice. You're going to feed the kids, or you're going to provide the bathrooms, or, what do you do? And so Idaho needs to be able to make Idaho's decisions. And so the more we turn over our budgetary authority to the federal government, the more we're subject to their whims. And I'd like to point out another thing too, that $2 billion surplus left on the table is about enough to eradicate property taxes across the state. And if it's not quite enough, remember the state budget has $1 billion in reserves, which is higher than it's ever been before. And so there is plenty of money in the state to be able to do real property tax relief. In fact, get rid of them altogether if that's what the state wanted to do. But instead, the governor's trying to appease all sides and appease Reclaim Idaho more than any others. And it's really frustrating. What Idaho needs is a Ron DeSantis, not a soft governor who's going to feed the leftists. I'll say it that way.
Okay, I would agree, and you were probably a lot nicer than I would be. But also, Ron, I've seen a paper going around that had a list of budget surpluses that school boards and school districts across the state have. And they weren't small potatoes. We're not talking like, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Some of them were in excess of $500,000 and sometimes more than that. And so I'm a little bit confused why we keep saying that our schools are in trouble. And then I go on to Transparent Idaho on the controller's website, and I see so much administratively heavy funding in our colleges and universities, and even on the district level. And I'm saying, okay, I'm not seeing the problem being that we don't have the money there for schools. This is 62% of our state budget goes into our schools. Remember, a big part of that is federal money. But how do we justify that? It looks to me like if we would take a closer look at where we're spending this money, and I want that money to go to our students and to those teachers who are on the ground in those classrooms trying to make a difference. I want my grandkids to come out of those schools knowing how to read and write and critically think. I don't think it's the school's place to teach them about social issues and all of this other stuff. That's our job as grandparents and parents. That's a social thing for outside of school. So, Ron, can you speak a little bit to us about these budget surpluses that we're seeing in our districts across the state?
Yeah, districts are carrying over a lot of funds every single year. For example, my school district here, Madison School District, has a budget of $60 million a year, but they carry over $24 million in reserves every year. That's about 40% of their budget. Looking at other districts, they're close to 30%. The state carries 20% in reserves. In fact, the state has $1 billion in reserves right now, like I mentioned before. So the districts are carrying over a lot of money. They are getting a lot of money from the state. The state is the primary funder of districts. The federal government is a much smaller fraction. Property taxes are somewhere in between. But and like I said, the state has increased its funding for schools. Today is Tuesday, August 30th. A lot of schools are doing bond and levy elections. I think the polls close in about 40 minutes. So I'll tell you this, if you haven't voted yet and you still need to, put this on record. Go and vote. You have 40 minutes to go vote, and then come back and listen to the rest and watch the rest of this program, because it's that important. The districts are asking for more and more money all the time. They always ask the state for more and more money. And they hold elections on these obscure dates, like late in August, when it's back to school night for parents and kids, so that they can have a captive audience to make their pitch. And the legislature several times has tried to move the election dates to just 2 dates, or to say if a bond or levy fails, you have to wait a longer period. And you know who fights that the most? The school boards, because they have become dependent on levies and bond elections over and over again. My school district here is renewing for a fifth time, trying to renew for a fifth time, a 2-year temporary levy. And so here we are 10 years, $20 million later, and they want another 2 years of $2 million a year. And they've been getting steady and significant increases from the state over time, massive increases from the federal government over the last 2 years. The schools are getting plenty of money, but we don't see the results. Reading scores, math scores, science scores are level to declining. And this is even before COVID. We can't blame it on remote learning or kids being suffocated from their masks. We're funding a system right now rather than funding the kids. And we need to refocus on kids.
I would totally agree with you on that, Ron. Just for 1 second, I had another thought, but before we get too far into this, I'd like to circle back around to the USDA program and the school lunch funding and having to comply with the woke agenda. I've heard a lot of talk about that lately, and people are asking, when is that going to go into effect? When are the schools going to have to comply with this? And I don't know. Do you have an answer to that?
Can you say that last part again?
When will the schools have to comply with the genderless bathrooms and set the USDA funding for the school lunch?
Thank you.
Do you know
my impression was that it was right away, that they were expected to do it immediately. On that track too, I would point out that this is feeling like a federal mandate because it's attached to federal dollars. But school districts have already been treading down this path. I would challenge all the viewers here to look in your districts. What is going on with curriculum? Ask to review the curriculum and the assigned books and textbooks, because it is public knowledge. It's public information. You should be able to see it. Review it. Also, you should go to your school board meetings and know what's going on all the time. We found out that here in Madison County, Rexburg, Idaho, our high school has an LGBT alphabet club. And there was a Pride in the Park event, and our Madison High School club was handing out stickers at the Pride event, just a few feet away from drag queens doing karaoke with youngsters in the audience. And you know, when education is suffering, maybe we shouldn't be distracted by all of these social issues. Like you said, that kind of education about values and culture and social norms and sexuality and all those topics are best left to parents and grandparents and families, because the school comes loaded with an agenda, and we've seen it over and over again. And so, you know, I saw a little debate online just recently about teachers, you know, a Wisconsin school board prohibited teachers from displaying flags in their class other than the American flag, or talking about gender identity or having their pronouns on their emails. And I applaud that. Our school boards ought to do the same thing, because education is not about indoctrination with a flag in the background. So I would say, yeah, have the American flag, but let's not even have the Gadsden flag, or Nazi flags, or the Pride flag, or the Confederate flag. You know, it's not a place for ideology. It's a place for education.
Exactly. Thank you. And I know it feels like in our discussion, we're moving away from discussing the session, but I think it's important that if we're going to keep throwing this money at our education system, that people who are watching and people that we get into these discussions with really understand what it is we're throwing money at and where this money is going and what's going to happen. So Ron, is back to the numbers, and I know I kind of feel like I'm moderating and you're just on the hot seat here, but we were talking about how 40% of our budget is federal money. But you mentioned in the conversation that we have the money that's appropriated through the state to our education system. And then we have the federal money that goes. Does some of that money then go directly to our schools? So we could look at this and say, do we have 62% of our state budget, and how many from the state going into education? But how do we track how much federal money goes, pass-through dollars, I believe they're called, go into our schools that are not tracked by the legislature. And I think that's another part of this equation when we start looking at throwing, what, 400 plus $billion a year plus 3% more every year after that. How many more pass-through dollars might be going into our school systems that we don't track, or do we track that?
That's a great question, because you look at it, especially in the COVID years, there was a lot more money going into schools than the state was merely appropriating. The federal government really stepped up things for COVID and COVID-related things, which was such a squishy definition that schools were basically using that money for all sorts of operations there. You can get an idea of this by looking at an example here again from Madison County. Sorry, I'm Madison School District centric here, but that's where I live. It's often advertised that Idaho is 51st in spending per student. But if you include all funds, and also if you look at the fact that of our state budget, how much of our budget goes to education, that puts Idaho in the top 15, I believe, if you look at how much the state is dedicating towards education. But Madison County is spending $11,326 per student. If you put that on the national scale, that's nowhere near 50th. There are many districts in Idaho that, if you count all funding, are well above what would count as the 50th in the state. And I would also point this out. Does throwing more money at schools lead to better results? Because it hasn't been statistically. Looking at Idaho, we have dedicated more and more, a greater percentage, greater dollar amounts all across the board to education. And what has happened to reading, science, and math scores? Level to declining. So it's not a money problem. It's a systemic problem. And I say the biggest solution to having government schools underperform is not throwing money. It is introducing competition, letting the money follow the students, letting the parents make decisions, letting schools compete for the students' attention, letting schools compete with one another. We have a lot of competition in the food industry, in the grocery industry, in cars. We have competition everywhere. But in schools, for some reason, because it's dominated by government, we don't have that competition. I can't imagine what schools would look like if they were introduced to the competition and innovative energies that come from profit maximization motives. It sounds,
I would agree.
Yeah, go ahead. What would a leftist say to all that? And what would you say to the leftist?
Well, I am not sure what the leftists would say, because I don't think that way. But what I would say is we have some amazing teachers in Idaho, and we have some amazing kids. And it's just like someone over here in the chat just put, they said, I've got a question. Does throwing money at a child make content go into his skull better? And I would say no. And I think the focus needs to be taken off of all of this social stuff and back onto reading, writing, and arithmetic. And let's give these kids what they need so that they learn how to critically think, and they learn how to understand, the basics of education. In our Constitution, it said that Idaho will provide a common education. And in that was written, that is reading, writing, and arithmetic, basic education up to starting somewhere in the first grade and up maybe into the 8th grade at the very most. And I believe the talent is here in Idaho for this, but we have got to cut the crap and get back to the basic education. Talk about throwing money at things that don't work. You can take a business model, a business plan that doesn't work, and you can throw all the money at it that you want. That if you're not serving your customers, you're not providing a service that's valuable to your customers, you're going to go out of business. And so for the government to continue to prop up our school systems, it's no different than propping up a really bad business plan and business model, because it's never going to get any better. It's just going to keep spending more and more and more money. And so, Wayne, I'm wondering here, are we getting close to out of time? We don't want to just like completely cut you out and take over your show and, start calling it the Hoff Time Ron and Christy report. But
Hey, I'll throw this out there. I do an analogy in my economics classes. Imagine if you got your groceries the way you get public education, that everyone was taxed a certain percentage at the local and state level. You had to pay in all these taxes. And then to get your groceries, you would go to the grocery store assigned to your area. So you wouldn't be able to just go to any grocery store. You go to the one in your area. And you would go through there, and the choices would be what the managers thought you might want. Now, if they made bad choices, it doesn't matter. They still get the money. You still have to go there. There's nowhere else to go. And what would be the incentives for your local public grocery store to do anything good? Now, they might say this, well, if you don't like this, go to that private store that has higher prices and everything, but we still get your tax dollars. What kind of service do you think you get? I think you get crap, because they know they don't have to worry about competition. They get your money anyway. And if you had the gall to say, you know what, I think we ought to let the money follow the families and let them choose the best groceries, they would say, oh, you must hate local grocers. You must hate families, because you're taking money away from public grocery. They won't have groceries anymore. You must hate them all. But it sounds absurd, but that's what we've been groomed to expect from our public education system. If we're going to dedicate so much money, 62% of our budget to education, we ought to let the families have some control in where that goes and what kind of education that they can get out of it, instead of being forced into their local public education system where they don't have much control. You and I, Christy, we voted similarly a lot. I don't watch everyone else's votes, but on education, I always made sure I vote for teachers and classroom operations, but I didn't vote for the excess and waste that went to administration or extra grants for this special topic here, special thing there. I voted on the basics so that families can keep as much money as they possibly could, and education could focus on the things that it really should be doing.
I voted the same way, Ron. And a lot of times we get ridiculed because we vote that way. We don't vote for the pork. We don't vote for the stuff that's not going to help our students actually learn. And talking about the choice in schools, in Mountain Home, there's a Montessori school. It is the most amazing school you will ever go to and you will ever visit. And they built a brand new building here a couple of years ago. They funded it themselves. These systems work. These schools that are outside of the public school system, they work, and it's an amazing thing. And so as we wrap up here, I want to encourage everybody that's listening to, everybody that's going to listen to it, you need to get with your legislators, and you especially need to get with your legislator if they have signed on to this bill and they have pledged their vote. And you need to make sure, did you pledge your vote before the bill was written, or did you pledge your vote after it when you knew what you were voting for? Because there's a very important distinction there. And you need to hold them accountable, and you need to hold their feet to the fire. And you need to watch this coming year what your legislators are voting for and voting on, because I think it's just going to go from bad to worse in the coming year. And if the governor can get this through and he can strong arm people into doing what he wants them to do this way, which we know happens, we see it all the time. You need to make sure that your senator and your representatives know that you're watching them. The call to action is get a hold of them. You've got a couple of days left. Watch the legislative session. Know what happens. Blast their emails. Blast their phones if you can see stuff going down that you don't approve of. Citizen action is important. Confrontational politics works.
Amen, Christy. People do need to be involved, because too many times legislators operate in empty committee rooms and empty galleries, and they don't know what's, but who does contact them? The big special interests, the school board association, the big interests who have a stake in this, the hospitals. All of them are in constant contact with legislators. And too many times I've seen legislators worry more about what their county commissioners or what the hospital board thinks, and not enough about what the taxpayer is going through and what households are going through. So yes, do those emails, do those phone calls. Thursday at 8 a.m., the legislature reconvenes. If it's at all in your ability, show up at the Capitol, let them know that you are interested in fighting inflation by giving the taxpayers back their dollars and not flooding education with even more money on top of the massive increases we've been having. The households ought to be the number one priority, because after all, the children in the schools, they also belong to families. And so the families are struggling with their property taxes, with their grocery bills, their gas bills, and their rent. And all of those things could be affected positively by lower taxes, lower property taxes.
Perfect. Thank you, Ron. Thank you very much. So I guess now it's time to wrap it up. Thank you for listening to the Hoff Time Report tonight, the Ron and Christy show, because Wayne's audio was pretty bad. Hope to see you Thursday. Pay attention. God bless and thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Hoff Time Report with Wayne Hoffman. Be sure to visit idahofreedom.org for Wayne's articles, IFF research, and show notes from today's episode.